August 1989. Weld County, Colorado. The worst drought in 30 years. The engineers said the water was gone. The hydrogeologist drove up from Denver, looked at the data, and said, nothing down there worth digging for. 68 years old. Alone. Alvin Creek lowered himself into a hole his grandfather dug in 1903, 42 feet of stone and darkness, with nothing but a pickaxe, a headlamp, and a theory about grass. Everyone in the county was watching their Ogallala wells fail. Alvin was listening to something they'd stopped paying attention to decades ago. At 47 feet, he found it. And everything Frank Donnelly had said about him at the county meetings, every laugh, every dismissal, every "that old fool," came due. This is the first thing Alvin Creek's father taught him, on a morning so dry the air itself seemed to crack when you breathed it. They were standing at the edge of the pasture in the summer of 1951, the summer Alvin turned 11, looking at a patch of grama grass that was somehow still green when everything around it had gone the color of old bone. His father was a quiet man who chose his words the way a careful farmer chooses seed, not for abundance but for quality, for the ones that would take root and grow into something lasting. Water doesn't forget where it wants to go, his father said, crouching down to touch the grass. It came here once and it will come again. The grass knows. Watch the grass. Alvin was 11 years old and he filed this instruction away in the place where children store the things adults say that they do not yet understand. He would not understand it for another 38 years. But when he finally did, when he was on his knees at the bottom of a hand-dug shaft 42 feet below the surface of his Weld County, Colorado pasture, his hands in mud, cold water rising around his wrists in the pre-dawn dark of a drought summer, he understood it so completely that it felt like remembering rather than learning, as if the knowledge had always been there, waiting for the right moment to surface. His name was Alvin Creek, and he was 68 years old in the summer of 1989, and he had just found water where the engineer said there was none. This is the story of how he knew where to look. The drought came the way droughts always come to the Colorado plains, not with a single decisive event but with a slow, accumulating withholding. First the April rains came light. Then May came dry. June brought 3 thunderstorms that crossed the county from northwest to southeast, vivid and dramatic and largely useless, dropping maybe a third of an inch each time before the sky closed back up like a fist. By July the wheat in the dryland fields had that particular gray-green color that meant the plant was conserving, drawing down its reserves, making the irreversible calculations of survival. By August, the creek that ran along the north fence line of Alvin Creek's 480-acre property, Dry Creek, which the locals called with the dark humor of people accustomed to the plains' literalness, had stopped running entirely and was nothing but a corridor of cracked gray mud and willow roots reaching down into nothing. The county had not seen conditions this severe since 1956, and some of the older farmers said it was worse than that you had to go back to 1934 to find a summer this relentless in its refusal. Alvin Creek stood on the front porch of his farmhouse in the early morning of August 3 and watched the sun come up over the flat eastern horizon the same way it had been coming up all summer, a hard, bright, merciless rising, no haze, no cloud, just the pure white hammer of it climbing above the plains. He was 68 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, and built in the way of men who have done physical labor their entire lives, not large but dense, with hands that looked as if they had been carved from something harder than ordinary flesh. He was thinking about water. Specifically, he was thinking about the shallow well in the southeast corner of the pasture, a hand-dug well his grandfather Erastus Creek had put down in 1903, 42 feet deep, lined with fieldstone and capped with a concrete lid that had cracked in the freeze of 1967 and been patched with galvanized sheet metal held down by 2 concrete blocks. Everyone else in Weld County who needed water was thinking about the Ogallala Aquifer. The Ogallala was the great underground reservoir stretching beneath 8 states from South Dakota to Texas, a vast deposit of ancient water laid down during the last ice age and slowly, steadily, inexorably being drawn down by the industrial wells of modern agriculture. In Weld County, the Ogallala sat anywhere from 50 to 350 feet below the surface. You got to it with a drilling rig and a steel casing and an electric pump capable of moving hundreds of gallons per minute, and when it worked it was magnificent, a transformation of semi-arid plains into productive cropland that would have seemed miraculous to Alvin's grandfather Erastus. But the Ogallala was not infinite. It was not renewable on any timescale that mattered to a working farmer. You drew it down faster than it recharged, and in a drought year like this one, when the recharge was zero and the demand was maximum, the water table dropped. Wells that had pumped reliably for decades began to pull air. Electric pumps burned out trying to lift water from depths their motors hadn't been designed to reach. The county extension office was getting calls every day from farmers whose Ogallala wells had gone dry or were running intermittent, And the advice the office gave: drill deeper, upgrade the pump, look into a new well, required money that most affected farmers didn't have in time that the drought wasn't going to give them. Alvin Creek's irrigation well was an Ogallala well. Drilled in 1971 by a rig from Fort Collins, 280 feet deep, fitted with a 12-horsepower submersible pump that could move 200 gallons a minute when the water table was where it was supposed to be. In the current drought, the table had dropped 22 feet from where it had been in the spring, and the pump was struggling. It was still running, but Alvin could hear the difference in the motor's sound, a slightly higher pitch than normal, a laboring quality that suggested the pump was working harder than it was designed to work. He had been listening to that pump for 18 years. He knew its sound the way you know the sound of your own heartbeat. He thought it might have 3 weeks left. Maybe 4. And then, unless the rains came, and the National Weather Service forecast was suggesting the rains were not coming for the foreseeable future, he would have no water for his cattle and no way to irrigate the winter wheat he was planning to seed in September. He stood on the porch and watched the sun climb and thought about his grandfather's well. The Weld County Extension Office held an emergency drought meeting on the 5th of August, in the Agricultural Center meeting room that smelled of coffee and old carpet and the institutional staleness of a room that has hosted too many meetings about problems without good solutions. There were 43 farmers in the room, more than the folding chairs could accommodate, and a dozen men stood along the back wall with arms crossed and expressions ranging from worried to actively angry. The extension director, a man named Gerald Marsh who had been in the job for 12 years and had the careful, slightly exhausted expression of a person whose job consisted largely of delivering bad news with professional equanimity, was explaining the situation. The situation was this: the drought was severe, potentially historic. The Ogallala water table in northern Weld County had dropped between 15 and 30 feet in the past 18 months. Several irrigation wells had already failed. More were expected to fail. The federal drought assistance program required a formal declaration process that took time. Private well drilling services were backed up 6 to 8 weeks. There were no good short-term solutions. What about the municipal water extension? Asked a man named Bert Kowalski, who farmed corn on 800 acres east of Greeley and whose Ogallala well had gone intermittent 3 weeks ago. Can we get the city water line extended out to the county road? The city's capacity is already strained, Gerald Marsh said. They can't extend service to agricultural properties in the current situation. So we're just supposed to watch our cattle die, Bert Kowalski said. It was not quite a question. There are tanker water services available. At what per gallon? Someone from the back wall called out. Gerald Marsh named a price that caused a short, bitter silence in the room. Alvin Creek was sitting in the third row, which was where he always sat at county meetings, close enough to hear clearly, far enough back to watch the whole room. He had a small spiral notebook in which he occasionally wrote things down, though more often he just listened. He had been listening to the discussion for 40 minutes, and what he was thinking about was not the Ogallala and not the tanker water services and not the federal assistance program. He was thinking about grass. There was a young man sitting 2 seats to his left, 26 or 27 years old, with the confident posture of someone who has recently come into possession of authority. He had introduced himself at the beginning of the meeting as Kyle Masterson, the new agricultural water specialist from the Colorado Division of Water Resources, in town to assess the drought impact and provide technical guidance. Kyle Masterson had good shoes and a pressed shirt and a leather portfolio in which he was making notes with a nice pen, and he had the quality of confidence that Alvin associated with people whose education had been thorough and whose practical experience was limited. Kyle Masterson had already spoken twice in the meeting, once to explain the hydrogeological situation in terms that were accurate but not particularly helpful, and once to recommend that farmers with failing wells consider transitioning to drip irrigation, which was sound advice in the abstract and nearly impossible to implement in the 6 weeks before winter wheat planting. After the meeting, when the chairs were scraping back and the coffee urn was being unplugged, Kyle Masterson approached Alvin Creek. "Mr. Creek," he said. He had done his homework, had spoken to Gerald Marsh beforehand and learned who the senior farmers in the county were, which was a mark in his favor. "I understand your irrigation well is still running. That's good news. But given the current trajectory of the water table, you should expect continued decline. Have you considered a supplemental well? There are state programs that can help with the drilling costs." "Drilling timeline is 6 to 8 weeks, Alvin said. "Unfortunately, yes. The rigs are in high demand. Winter wheat goes in September. 8 weeks puts me in October." Kyle Masterson acknowledged this with a slight tightening around his eyes. "That's a difficult timeline," he admitted. "In your specific situation, what's your backup?" "I've got an old well," Alvin said. "Hand dug. My grandfather put it down in 1903. Kyle Masterson looked at him with the expression of a man trying to be respectful of something he considers irrelevant. Those old shallow wells typically access the perched water table, the first layer of groundwater above the clay layer. In a drought of this severity, the perched water table is usually the first to fail. It depends on recharge from local precipitation, which, he gestured at the clear blue sky through the meeting room window, as you know, hasn't been happening. I know what the perched water table depends on, Alvin said, pleasantly. I'm not questioning your knowledge, Kyle Masterson said, with the slightly elevated care of someone who realizes they may have misstepped. I'm just saying that for practical purposes, in this drought, a 40-foot hand-dug well is probably not going to be a reliable water source. The hydrogeology. Have you ever dug a well by hand? Alvin asked. A pause. No, Kyle Masterson said. That's not, modern well construction doesn't really. The hydrogeology is correct, Alvin said. Generally. But hydrogeology is a general science and water is a specific thing. It goes to specific places for specific reasons. And sometimes the reason is something you can only see if you've been looking at the same piece of ground for 40 years. He picked up his notebook and tucked it in his shirt pocket. I appreciate your time. He left Kyle Masterson standing by the empty coffee urn with his leather portfolio and his nice pen, and drove home along the county road through the brown and gray landscape of the worst drought in 30 years. Alvin Creek had been watching the grass in the southeast corner of his pasture since 1951, when his father had crouched beside it and said, "Water doesn't forget where it wants to go." That had been 38 years ago, and Alvin had watched the grass every summer since, not obsessively, not as a scientific project, but in the way that a farmer watches everything on his land, continuously and without effort, registering changes the way you register the sound of a door closing in another room. The grass was there, and he noticed it, and over 38 years he had built up a record in his memory that no instrument had measured and no database contained. What the record showed was this: in the southeast corner of the pasture, in an area roughly 40 feet in diameter centered on the old stone well his grandfather had dug in 1903, the grass stayed green approximately 2 weeks longer than the surrounding pasture after a dry period. This was true in dry summers and in wet summers. It was true in years when the summer heat came early and in years when it came late. It was true regardless of grazing pressure, because Alvin had rotated his cattle in that pasture in a consistent pattern for decades and the grass in the southeast corner received the same grazing pressure as the surrounding ground. 2 weeks. In a normal dry summer, 2 weeks of extra green was noticeable but not dramatic. In a summer like 1989, 2 weeks of extra green was extraordinary. In a summer like 1989, the rest of the pasture was the color of straw by the first week of August, and the southeast corner was still, faintly, stubbornly, green. Alvin had checked the well in early June, when the drought was becoming clear but had not yet reached its current severity. He had lifted the galvanized sheet metal lid, laid on his stomach, and shone a flashlight down the stone-lined shaft. The water was there, not as high as it should have been, but there. He had measured it with a weighted string, 31 feet to the water surface, 11 feet of water above the gravel bottom of the well. He had not told anyone about this. It was not the kind of thing he talked about at the extension office meetings. In the days after the meeting with Kyle Masterson, Alvin went back to the southeast corner 3 times. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the green patch, not looking at the grass itself but at the way the soil lay around it, the slight, almost imperceptible depression in the center of the green area that he had first noticed in 1962 and had been watching ever since. A depression of perhaps 2 inches over a 40-foot diameter. Not enough to pool water after rain. Just enough to suggest that something below the surface was different, denser, or softer, or arranged in a way that directed moisture differently than the surrounding ground. He got down on his hands and knees in the dry August heat and pushed his fingers into the soil at the edge of the green patch and then into the soil a few feet outside it. Inside the patch, the soil was drier at the surface than he expected. The grass was using whatever moisture it had access to efficiently. But 8 inches down, his fingers found something the soil outside the patch did not have: a slight coolness. A memory of water. He stood up and looked at the well cap and made a decision. On the morning of August 8, Alvin Creek went to the hardware store in Greeley and bought a pickaxe, 2 50-foot lengths of nylon rope, a hand winch, a headlamp, 6 buckets, and a pair of rubber waders. He came home, moved the concrete blocks off the sheet metal well cap, folded back the cap, looked down the shaft for a long time, and then lowered himself into it. The shaft was 36 inches in diameter, wide enough for a man to work in, barely. The stone lining was dry at the top, damp at about 15 feet, and wet below 20. The air in the shaft was cold and smelled of minerals and old earth, a smell like the inside of a root cellar except deeper, as if the root cellar went down forever. He worked for 6 hours that first day, deepening the well by hand. Erastus Creek had come to Weld County in 1899, the same year as most things that mattered in the early history of that part of Colorado. He had come from Ohio, from a small farm outside Mansfield where the soil was heavy and dark and water was something you mostly took for granted. He had come because the railroad land companies were selling 160-acre parcels for $3 an acre, and the pamphlets they distributed in the small towns of the Middle West showed photographs of green fields and prosperous farmsteads that were, as Erastus would later tell his children, not exactly lying but not exactly telling the whole truth either. He had arrived in late September, when the plains could look deceptively like the Ohio country he had left, green from the fall rains, sky a deep blue, the horizon so far away it seemed theoretical. He had bought his land, built a sod house, broken 30 acres of grassland with a team of horses and a steel plow, and planted winter wheat in October. The following summer had been dry. The summer after that had been drier. By 1901, Erastus Creek understood that water on the Colorado High Plains was not something you could take for granted. It was something you had to find, and store, and husband with the care you gave to money in a bank that you weren't entirely sure would still be open in the morning. He dug the well in the summer of 1903, working alone through June and July, lowering himself down on a rope each morning and hauling up buckets of rock and dirt each evening. He was 41 years old and in good health, and the digging took him 9 weeks. He hit water at 38 feet, in a layer of saturated gravel that he would later describe to his son as the sweetest thing I ever found in this ground. He lined the shaft with fieldstone he had gathered from the creek bed a quarter-mile to the north, mortaring them in place with a mix he made himself from lime and sand. He capped it with a slab of sandstone he had hauled from a quarry 30 miles away. He had positioned the well in the southeast corner of the pasture for a reason he explained to his son many years later. I watched where the cattle went to stand in a dry summer. They always knew where the ground held water longest. Animals know. This was the same principle Alvin's father had passed to Alvin in 1951, framed in terms of grass rather than cattle, but pointing to the same underlying truth. The years after his arrival had taught Erastus things the railroad pamphlets had not mentioned. They had taught him about the Great Plains wind, not a coastal wind or a mountain wind but something uniquely itself, a wind that came from a great distance and arrived with the memory of that distance in it, drying and persistent, capable in the worst seasons of lifting topsoil and carrying it somewhere else entirely. They had taught him about the relationship between mountain snowpack and the following summer's water, how a shallow winter in the Rockies translated, months later, into a creek that stopped running in July. They had taught him that water on the eastern Colorado plains was never something to take for granted, and that the men who did take it for granted were the ones who eventually lost their land when the pattern asserted itself. Erastus had come from a place where water was abundant. He had to unlearn abundance before he could learn what the plains required. This unlearning took approximately 5 years and was the most important education of his farming life. By 1905, Erastus Creek had developed what his neighbors regarded as an excessive preoccupation with water. He measured his well level every week and recorded it in a notebook. He observed the creek to the north with the attention of a man reading a text he expected to yield important information. He watched where his cattle went on hot days, noting what he observed, building over years a picture of how water moved through and under his specific piece of ground. His son Leonard, Alvin's father, had inherited both the thoroughness and the understanding it produced. He maintained the notebook and the well and the habit of observation, and passed them to Alvin in 1951 with the same economy of words the Creek family applied to important things. Water doesn't forget where it wants to go. Watch the grass. 4 words. The entire inheritance. It was enough. The well had been in continuous use for 45 years by the time Alvin inherited the farm in 1958, providing water for the household and livestock through 2 world wars and the Dust Bowl years of the 1930s, when the Ogallala wells the neighbors had drilled in the 1920s went erratic and the electric pump sat idle in fields without power. Erastus's well had never failed. Alvin had converted to Ogallala water in 1971, when the irrigation well was drilled and the economics of modern agriculture made the deep aquifer the obvious choice. The old well had been kept clean and capped but largely unused for 18 years, maintained with the same habit of care that kept unused parts on shelves in the barn, not because they were needed now, but because the world had a way of making things needed again. He had never told anyone this. It was not the kind of thing that came up at county meetings. Hand digging a well is one of the oldest forms of skilled labor in human history, and like all old skills it has been replaced so thoroughly by mechanical alternatives that most people who have not done it have no accurate picture of what it involves. It is not simply digging a hole. It is excavating a cylindrical space in the earth while suspended inside that space, working at the bottom of a shaft that is simultaneously the workspace and the most dangerous part of the environment, with the constant awareness that the walls around you are held in place by nothing except the nature of the soil and whatever lining has been installed, and that the failure of either of these things will bury you before you can call for help. Alvin Creek had helped his father deepen the well twice, once in 1954, when a crack appeared in the stone lining 20 feet down and needed to be repointed, and once in 1961, when a dry summer like this one prompted his father to dig an additional 4 feet to access a deeper gravel layer, bringing the total depth from Erastus's original 38 feet to 42. He had been a young man both times, strong and unworried about small things, and he had not been the one making the decisions about where to dig and how fast to go and when the soil was too unstable to continue. Now he was 68 years old, and he was making all the decisions himself. He worked methodically. He descended each morning on the nylon rope, using a simple harness he had fashioned from a length of climbing rope and 2 carabiners bought at the mountaineering shop in Fort Collins. He wore the headlamp on his forehead and the rubber waders on his legs, and he carried a short-handled pick and a flat-bottomed spade. He worked for 3 hours in the morning and came up, rested for an hour, went back down for 2 hours in the afternoon, and came up again in the early evening. The first 3 feet of new digging were in dense blue clay, the same clay layer that Erastus had worked through in 1903, the cap that sat above the gravel aquifer. Alvin chipped through it with the pick, working in slow, careful strokes in the confined space, loading the chips into buckets that he hauled up with the hand winch. The clay was hard and cold and slow, and he averaged perhaps 8 inches per day. Below the clay was gravel, water-bearing gravel, the same gravel Erastus had found 86 years before. Alvin was now working below the original well bottom, in ground that no human hand had previously touched, and the gravel was saturated. Each stroke of the spade brought up material that was wet and heavy, and the water level in the well rose slightly as he worked, seeping in from the sides and bottom at a rate he measured each evening by lowering a weighted string. This was the thing he was looking for. Not just water, he had known there was water here, he had measured it in June. He was looking for the rate of seepage, which would tell him whether this was a static pocket of old water or a moving system that would recharge. A static pocket would give him water for weeks. A moving system would give him water indefinitely. On the 5th day of digging, at 45 feet, something changed. He felt it before he saw it, a change in the gravel, a coarser texture under the spade, and then a sound. A faint, almost inaudible sound, like water moving very slowly over stone a long distance away. He stopped digging and crouched in the narrow shaft and listened. The water was moving. Not flowing, not a stream, nothing like that, moving the way water moves through saturated gravel, molecule by molecule, following the gradient of a slope so gentle it would not register on any instrument less sensitive than geological time. But moving. Alive. Connected to something larger than a pocket. He came up out of the well and sat on the ground beside it and looked at the grass, the green patch, still faintly green in the August heat, and he thought about what his father had said. Water doesn't forget where it wants to go. He went back down and kept digging. The work required a kind of patience that Alvin had not exercised in exactly this form before, though he recognized it as a cousin to the patience required by farming in general. Farming asked you to prepare in one season for results in another, to plant knowing you might not harvest, to build soil for decades so that a single good year would be possible. The well asked for a more compressed version of the same discipline. Each day's work was small, each foot of progress hard won, and the reward invisible until you were already deep enough in the project to have committed to it fully. He also had to manage the physical reality of his age. He was 68 years old, and the work in the shaft was demanding in ways it would not have been at 40. His lower back stiffened after an hour of crouching. His hands, which had done physical work for decades, tired more quickly than they once had. He came up from the shaft twice in the mornings when his body told him firmly that the decision about when to stop belonged to it and not to his schedule. He did not push through these signals. He had learned, over decades of farming, that the body's warnings were accurate, and that the men who ignored them paid in ways more expensive than the time they saved. He came up when he needed to, rested until he felt right, and went back down. The well would take as long as it took. The water was not going anywhere. In the evenings he sat on the porch with a glass of water from the house tap and looked at the southeast corner of the pasture in the fading light and thought about Erastus. The old man had been dead for 40 years, and his presence on the farm had faded to physical artifacts, the fieldstone of the well lining, the placement of the main barn relative to the prevailing wind, the cottonwood variety he had planted along the north fence line that still provided shade in summer and broke the wind in winter. These were the decisions of a man thinking in decades rather than years, who had understood that the choices you made for a farm were choices you were often making for people you would never meet. Alvin's own children had not stayed on the farm. His son Robert was in Denver, managing a building supply company, and had been for 20 years. His daughter Claire had gone to California in 1972 and had not come back except for visits. This was the pattern of the second half of the 20th century in agricultural America. The land stayed, the families dispersed, and what remained was the connection between a single steward and a piece of ground, without the multi-generational continuity that Erastus had assumed when he planted the cottonwoods. What Alvin thought about, on the porch in the August evenings, was whether the knowledge of the well, how to find it, how to maintain it, what it meant and where it connected, would survive the passage of another generation. He thought about this and could not answer it. Eventually he went to bed. The Creek Farm shared its east boundary with the Halverson operation, 200 acres of irrigated corn and sugar beets, run by a man named Dale Halverson and his two sons, Craig and Tommy. Dale Halverson was 58 years old and had expanded his operation aggressively over the past decade, buying a neighboring farm when it went up for sale in 1982 and financing the purchase with an operating loan that made sense at 6% interest and had become considerably less comfortable as rates climbed. Dale Halverson had 3 Ogallala irrigation wells, all drilled between 1968 and 1979, all currently experiencing reduced output. His response to the drought had been to order a 4th well drilled. He was on the 6-week waiting list for a rig from the drilling company in Fort Collins, and to reduce his planted acreage by 30% while he waited for the water situation to resolve. He had heard about Alvin Creek and his hand dug well from a conversation at the grain elevator in late August. The person who told him about it had done so with the amused tone people use when describing the harmless eccentricities of their neighbors. Old Alvin's down in that ancient well with a pickaxe, can you believe it? And Dale Halverson had laughed the appropriate laugh. But he had also filed it in the category of things to keep an eye on, because Dale Halverson had been farming next to Alvin Creek for 30 years and had learned, through various episodes, that Alvin Creek's decisions had a tendency to look eccentric until they didn't. He drove over to the Creek farm on the 15th of August on the pretext of returning a post-hole digger he had borrowed in the spring. Alvin was at the southeast corner of the pasture when Dale arrived, sitting on an overturned bucket beside the open well cap, drinking water from a mason jar. He was dirty from the morning's work, gray clay on his forearms and his waders and the front of his shirt, and he looked, Dale thought, better than he had looked in some time. There was a quality of engaged concentration about him, the look of a man working on a problem he finds interesting. Post-hole diggers in the truck, Dale said, coming across the dry pasture. Appreciate it, Alvin said. Coffee in the house if you want. I'm good. Dale looked at the well cap, at the rope and hand winch and the pile of excavated gravel beside the shaft. You're actually doing it. Doing what? Deepening that old well. By hand. Dale shook his head, but without the amusement that had been in his voice at the elevator. Up close, looking at the operation, it did not seem eccentric. It seemed deliberate. What are you finding? Moving water, Alvin said. Below the original well bottom. Seeping in at about 6 gallons an hour right now. Dale did the arithmetic. 6 gallons an hour was 144 gallons a day. For cattle in a drought, that was not much, enough for perhaps 20 head to drink, no more. But it was something. You think it'll hold? He asked. In a drought this bad? I think it'll increase, Alvin said. The gravel layer I'm in now has a different character than the upper layer. Coarser. More connected. I think it's fed from the creek system to the north, underground. Hydrogeologists told me the perched water table in this area is completely depleted. This might not be the perched water table, Alvin said. He looked at the grass. This patch of grass has been green every summer for 38 years, including the dry ones. The perched water table doesn't explain that. Something else does. Dale Halverson looked at the grass. He was not a man who had thought much about grass in its own right. He grew corn and beets, not grass, but he could see what Alvin was describing. The green patch was unmistakable against the gray-brown of the surrounding pasture. What does explain it? He asked. A buried channel, Alvin said. I think there's an old stream channel down there, 20, 30 feet below grade, that's still carrying some flow even in this drought. The stream moved when the creek was rerouted, or maybe it moved on its own over time. But the underground channel is still there, carrying a small, slow seep. And the grass knew. Dale looked at him for a long moment. That's a significant theory. I know. If you're right. Then I'll have water, Alvin said. Not a lot. But enough. Dale picked up the post hole digger from the truck bed and leaned it against the fence post. Need help pulling the buckets up? Alvin looked at him. Wouldn't turn it down, he said. Word traveled in Weld County the way word has always traveled in agricultural communities, through the grain elevator and the feed store and the coffee counter at the diner in Kersey and the parking lots of the extension office meetings and the efficient grapevine of people who live in close proximity to each other's difficulties. The word that traveled about Alvin Creek in August of 1989 was initially amusement shading into mild concern. A 68-year-old man, alone, digging a well by hand, in the worst drought in decades. The general consensus was that it was the kind of thing old men did when they had too much time and too much stubbornness and not enough sense to recognize when a situation was beyond them. The loudest voice in this consensus belonged to a man named Frank Donnelly, who operated 600 acres of irrigated farmland 3 miles south of the Creek Farm and who had appointed himself, over the years, the primary authority on rational agricultural practice in his section of the county. Frank Donnelly was 52 years old, drove a new pickup truck, sat on the board of the County Farm Bureau, and had a talent for turning other people's decisions into cautionary tales at public meetings. He first mentioned Alvin Creek at the second drought meeting, on August 20th, while the conversation was moving through the list of options available to farmers with failing irrigation wells. I heard old Alvin Creek is digging a hand well out there on his place, Frank Donnelly said, into a pause in the discussion. He said it with the inflection that means, is anyone else hearing this absurdity? Several people turned toward him. Down in the shaft with a pickaxe, like it's 1889. Man's going to hurt himself. Alvin Creek's been hurt less often than most people I know, said Margaret Overbeck, who farmed 300 acres to Alvin's north and had known him for 30 years. That's not the point, Frank Donnelly said. The point is it's not going to work. The water table in this county is depleted. A 40-foot hand well is not going to do anything useful in this drought. The Extension Office will tell you that, the Water Resources Division will tell you that. Has the Extension Office been to Alvin's southeast corner lately? Margaret Overbeck asked. What's in Alvin's southeast corner? Apparently something worth digging for, Margaret said, and looked at her coffee cup. Kyle Masterson, present at this meeting as he had been at the previous one, spoke up with the careful restraint of a man choosing how much to invest in a position he has already staked. I spoke with Mr. Creek at the first meeting, he said. I explained the hydrogeological situation. The perched water table in that area. The perched water table, Frank Donnelly said, approvingly, as a man says a phrase that sounds authoritative. Is very unlikely to provide reliable yield in current drought conditions, Kyle finished. I don't doubt that Mr. Creek is a capable farmer. But the science here is fairly clear. What does the science say about grass? Margaret Overbeck asked. Kyle Masterson looked at her. I'm sorry? About a patch of green grass that stays green 6 weeks longer than the surrounding pasture in a drought year. What does the science say about that? That could be any number of things, Kyle Masterson said. Soil texture variation, microtopography, different root systems. Could it be an underground water source? It could be consistent with an underground water source, yes, but... Then maybe the old man knows something, Margaret said, and went back to her coffee. Frank Donnelly did not go back to his coffee. Frank Donnelly went to the Extension Office the following morning and asked Gerald Marsh for whatever hydrogeological data existed for the Creek Farm area, and Gerald Marsh gave him what there was, a general water table depth map from 1978 and a single well log from a test bore drilled half a mile to the east in 1965. Frank Donnelly looked at these materials and confirmed to his own satisfaction that the hydrogeology did not support Alvin Creek's theory, and he told people so at the feed store and at the diner and at the Farm Bureau board meeting, in the tone of a man performing a public service. He did not drive out to the Creek Farm. He did not look at the grass. On the 22nd of August, at 47 feet below the surface, Alvin Creek broke into something that was not gravel. He was working in the early afternoon, alone. Dale Halverson had helped him for 3 days the previous week and had offered to come again, but Alvin had told him to tend his own operation, that the well was progressing and he could manage. He was crouching at the bottom of the shaft with his headlamp on and his short spade working through a layer of coarse gravel that had been getting progressively wetter over the past 4 feet of digging, when the spade broke through into what felt like open space below him. He stopped immediately. He put down the spade and pressed his palm flat against the bottom of the shaft and felt it, a vibration, barely perceptible, as if something below the floor was moving. Not flowing, not churning. Just moving. The slow, persistent movement of water in a connected system, water that had somewhere to come from and somewhere to go. He pulled his palm back and looked at it. It was wet, more wet than it should have been from the saturated gravel around him. The water was coming up. He sat in the shaft for a long time, listening. The confined space amplified sounds below him and muffled sounds above, and in the cone of his headlamp he watched the water level rising slowly at the bottom of the shaft, not dramatically, not in a rush, but steadily, with the patient persistence of water finding its level. He had found the buried channel. Not a river, nothing like that. A seam of saturated rock and gravel, an ancient drainage feature buried by millennia of sediment, that the surface creek to the north had been connected to once and perhaps was still connected to underground, in ways that surface surveying and test bores could not easily detect. It was exactly what he had suspected. It was exactly what the grass had been telling him. He came up out of the well and sat beside it on the ground, in the August heat, and looked at the green patch around him. He was breathing hard from the climb and his arms were shaking slightly, and he felt, underneath the physical exhaustion, something he could only describe as vindication, not the aggressive vindication of a man who wants to say "I told you so," but the quieter vindication of a man whose understanding of a specific piece of ground has been confirmed by the ground itself. He lowered a weighted string into the new water. The water level stabilized at 43 feet, 4 feet of water above the bottom of the shaft. He pulled the string up and marked it and let an hour pass and lowered it again. The water level had risen 2 inches. He went back down. Getting water out of a hand-dug well required a pump, and getting the right pump was not straightforward. The submersible pumps designed for modern drilled wells were made for 6-inch steel casings, not 36-inch stone-lined shafts. A submersible pump dropped into the old well would rattle around loose and possibly damage the stone lining. A surface-mounted centrifugal pump required a suction pipe drop to the water level, which at 43 feet was just at the practical limit of centrifugal pump suction. Most surface pumps could pull water reliably from 30 feet, with difficulty to 35, and very marginally to 40. 43 feet was asking for trouble. Alvin spent 2 evenings in the Greeley Library reading pump catalogs and hydraulic engineering references, and what he concluded was that the right solution was a pitcher pump, the old-fashioned cylinder pump that had been standard equipment on hand-dug wells for 100 years before electric pumps made them obsolete. A pitcher pump used a simple piston mechanism and a foot valve at the bottom of the drop pipe. It could lift water from depths up to 50 feet with a single operator working the handle, and it required no electricity, no motor, and could be repaired with parts available at any hardware store that catered to rural customers. He found a pitcher pump at a farm auction in Longmont, an old Dempster, cast iron, still working, that had come off a farm sold and consolidated with a larger operation. He paid $60 for it and drove it home in the back of his truck and spent an afternoon installing it over the well, lowering the drop pipe and foot valve down the shaft, priming it with a bucket of water from the house, and working the handle. The first 10 strokes brought up air and rust. The next 10 brought up water. He caught it in a bucket and looked at it. It was clear. It was cold. It smelled of minerals and the deep earth, the clean, specific smell of water that has been filtered through miles of gravel and stone over decades or centuries. He put his face into the bucket and drank from it, and it was the best water he had tasted since he was a child. He sat beside the pump and looked at the green grass and thought about Erastus, dead for 40 years, who had found this same water in this same place in the summer of 1903 with nothing but his own labor and his observation of where the cattle went to stand. He thought about what Kyle Masterson had said about the hydrogeology. He thought about Frank Donnelly and his authoritative confidence. He pumped another bucket and watered his dog, who had been sitting patiently nearby watching the operation with the philosophical acceptance of a dog who has lived on a working farm long enough to understand that humans do incomprehensible things for comprehensible reasons. Then he went inside and called Dale Halverson. September came hot and dry and brought no relief. The National Weather Service forecast continued to show no significant precipitation in the near-term outlook. The Ogallala water table continued to drop. 3 more irrigation wells in Weld County went dry in the first 2 weeks of September, and the tanker water services were running continuously between the municipal depot in Greeley and the farms that needed water for their livestock. Alvin Creek planted his winter wheat on the 6th of September, using his irrigation well, still running, laboring but running, to pre-water the field before planting. He planted 40 acres less than his usual acreage, concentrating the seed on his best ground and leaving the lighter, drier fields fallow. A conservative decision that cost him something in the short term and would save him something in the long term, though in the short term it was hard to feel the savings. The hand-dug well was producing reliably. He had measured its output carefully over the past 3 weeks. In a 24-hour period, with moderate pumping, it yielded approximately 300 gallons. This was not a lot by the standards of modern irrigation. His Ogallala pump could produce 200 gallons a minute, but it was sufficient for his cattle. He had 35 head of beef cattle and they needed, in this heat, about 15 gallons per animal per day. 525 gallons a day total. His well could produce 300. The difference he made up from the tail end of his Ogallala pump, now drawing water from a depth 5 feet greater than it had been in June. He had also begun filling a 500-gallon storage tank beside the well each night, pumping slowly for 3 or 4 hours while he did other work, letting the well recharge between sessions. By morning the tank was half full. By evening it was full again. This buffering strategy, which he had read about in an old farmer's almanac from 1937 found in his father's papers, allowed him to draw more total water from the system than continuous pumping would have allowed, by giving the well time to recover between sessions. He had told Dale Halverson about this, who had helped him build the tank platform one Saturday morning and asked questions with the practical directness of a man evaluating information for possible use. "If you can show this is a real source," Dale said, nailing the last board on the platform frame, "and if it's connected to something bigger underground, you think there might be more of it? Other places on the county?" "I think there might be," Alvin said. "The buried drainage system I'm accessing doesn't stop at my property line. It goes wherever the old drainage went. You'd have to find it. You'd have to know what to look for." Dale put down his hammer and looked at him. "What do you look for?" "Green grass," Alvin said. "In a dry summer, green grass where it shouldn't be green. That's the first sign. Then you walk the land carefully and look for depressions, very slight ones, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you were paying attention. And you look for where the animals go." He paused. "Cattle know. They've always known." Dale looked at his pastures, visible beyond the fence line to the east, all of them the uniform gray-brown of deep drought. "My cattle have been bunching up in the southwest corner of the back pasture," he said, slowly. "I figured it was the shade from the tree row." "There's shade elsewhere in that pasture," Alvin said. Dale was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "There is." The September County Farm Bureau meeting was held on the 12th, in the same meeting room at the Agricultural Center, with many of the same people and a mood that had darkened considerably since August. 2 of the men who had been in the room at the August meetings were no longer farming, their operations had been taken over by their banks, events so rapid and so brutal that they seemed to have happened between one meeting and the next with no space for intervention. Frank Donnelly was in his customary position, third chair from the left on the second row, close enough to the front to be heard easily. He had driven through the Creek Farm section on his way to the meeting, out of a curiosity he would have been reluctant to admit was curiosity, and he had seen through the fence line as he drove past the pitcher pump installed beside the open well, the storage tank, the green patch of grass around it all. He had driven on without stopping. In the meeting, when the topic of supplemental water sources came up, Frank Donnelly said, "I understand Alvin Creek's got a hand-dug well working out there on his place. Pitcher pump. Producing, what, 100, 200 gallons a day?" He said it in the tone of a man presenting a data point. The implicit message was, 100 gallons a day, how is that relevant to anyone? "Closer to 300, said Dale Halverson, from the fourth row. He said it quietly, as a correction, not as an argument. 300 gallons a day, Frank Donnelly said. "My cows drink that before noon." "Alvin's herd isn't as large as yours," Dale said. 300 a day covers his cattle. Plus what he can pull from the Ogallala tail end. The Ogallala tail end that's going to give out in. "It hasn't given out," Dale said. "Alvin's still planting winter wheat." There was a slight shift in the room, a change in attention, a reorientation of whose words people were weighing. Alvin Creek was known in the county for his careful management, his paid-off land, his tendency to be right about things in the long run even when he looked wrong in the short term. The hand-dug well had been a joke. Now it was producing 300 gallons a day in a drought that was shutting down Ogallala wells, and Alvin Creek was planting winter wheat when other farmers were leaving fields fallow. "The point," Kyle Masterson said, with the careful balance of someone who has invested a public position and is not quite ready to abandon it, is that one farmer's situation in a specific location with specific subsurface conditions doesn't necessarily indicate that this approach would work across the county. "No," Dale Halverson said. "But it might indicate it in specific locations with similar conditions. And those locations might be identifiable." "You'd need to survey for them," Kyle said. "Alvin surveyed his," Dale said. "Took him 38 years of watching, but he surveyed it." Frank Donnelly said nothing. He was looking at the window. Frank Donnelly drove to the Creek Farm on a Saturday morning in late September. He had thought about it for 2 weeks and decided against it several times before finally deciding for it on the Friday evening when he was looking at his water bill from the tanker service and doing arithmetic that came out uncomfortably on the wrong side of the ledger. His Ogallala wells were still running, but barely, and the fourth well that was supposed to be drilled was still 4 weeks away, and 4 weeks at current tanker rates was a significant sum. He told himself he was going as a neighbor. He was not entirely wrong. Alvin was at the well when Frank arrived, working the pitcher pump handle in a slow, steady rhythm, filling the storage tank. He was wearing his usual work clothes and an old straw hat, and he did not look up immediately when Frank's truck came across the pasture, because he was watching the water coming out of the pump and he was counting strokes. Frank parked and got out and walked across to the well. He looked at the pump, at the tank, at the shaft with its stone lining and the rope and winch beside it. He looked at the green grass. He stood there for a moment. "You found something down there," he said. It was not a question. "I found something," Alvin agreed. "What is it?" "Buried drainage channel. Below the perched water table, above the Ogallala. Something in between that the hydrogeological surveys hadn't accounted for." Frank Donnelly was quiet, watching the pump handle go up and down and the water coming out, steady and clear. The green grass around them had grown slightly taller in the October rains. Not lush, the drought had gone too deep for a week of rain to undo, but alive, visibly alive against the surrounding brown. You could not look at that grass and the gray-brown extending in every direction and deny that something was different here. The ground itself was making the argument, patiently and without drama. "I said some things at the meetings," Frank said finally. "About this. About you." "I know," Alvin said. He kept pumping. "I said it wasn't going to work." "I know that too." Another silence. Frank Donnelly was a proud man, and what he was doing required something of him that proud men find expensive. "I was wrong," he said. Alvin kept the pump going for 3 more strokes and then let it rest. He looked at Frank Donnelly, at the man's face, which was doing the complicated work of honesty. "You were working from the available information," Alvin said. "The available information was incomplete." "I was dismissive," Frank said. "That's different from working from incomplete information." Alvin acknowledged this with a slight nod. "It was different. Is there anything I can do?" Frank asked. "I've got 400 acres of pasture land east of the main operation. Sandy soil, low ground on the south end. In dry years the south end always holds green longer than the rest." Alvin looked at him. "You've been watching it?" "Not intentionally. But I know my land." "Every farmer knows his land," Alvin said. "The question is whether you let what you know lead you somewhere you haven't been before." He put his hand back on the pump handle. "Come back Tuesday morning," he said. "I'll walk your south pasture with you and see what's there." Alvin walked Dale Halverson's southwest pasture on the 17th of September and Frank Donnelly's south pasture on the 21st, and he walked them the same way he had walked his own southeast corner, slowly, looking at the grass, feeling the soil, paying attention to the topography with the part of his mind trained over decades to register things below the threshold of conscious observation. In Dale Halverson's southwest corner, he found what Dale had described, cattle bunching in an area that had shade available elsewhere in the pasture. He walked the area and found the depression, barely a foot of relief over 100-foot diameter, the kind of topographic feature that would not register on a casual inspection and might not register on a standard survey. He dug down 18 inches with a post-hole digger he had brought in the truck, and at 18 inches the soil was noticeably cooler and slightly wetter than he expected. "There's something here," he told Dale. "Whether it connects to a productive seam or not, I don't know, but the surface indicators are similar to what I had on my place. Worth digging a test hole." "I'll do it myself," Dale said. "Do you know how to work in a shaft?" "Teach me." On Frank Donnelly's south pasture, the indicators were less clear. The grass stayed green, but the depression was subtle and the soil test at 18 inches was ambiguous, slightly cool but not markedly wetter. Alvin told Frank honestly what he thought, that there might be something there, but it was less certain than Dale's location, and that digging was not low-risk work for a man doing it alone. "I won't be alone," Frank said. "I'll hire someone to help." "Hire someone who knows what they're doing," Alvin said. "Not just someone who can hold a shovel." Frank Donnelly looked at him. "Do you know someone?" "I know myself," Alvin said. "I'll come and supervise if you want. But I'm not young. What I can offer is knowing what to look for. The actual digging you'll need a younger body for." The rains came on the 14th of October, 3.5 months after the drought had begun to bite in earnest, and they came the way the best rains come to the plains, steadily, Persistently, with the patient thoroughness of weather that means to accomplish something. Not a violent storm. Not the dramatic lightning and furious downpour that produces runoff before the ground can absorb it. Just rain, gray and steady, for 4 days. By the time it stopped, Weld County had received 2.8 inches, not enough to end the drought, which was measured in aquifer levels and would take years to fully recover, but enough to change the immediate calculus of survival. Enough to germinate the winter wheat planted in late September. Enough to refill the stock ponds that had gone dry in August. Enough to let farmers breathe. Alvin Creek's hand-dug well responded to the rain in a way that confirmed what he had suspected about its connection to the drainage system. On the second day of rain, the water level in the well rose 4 inches, not a dramatic rise, but a clear and immediate response to surface precipitation feeding the underground system he had tapped. On the third day it rose 2 more inches. By the time the rain stopped, the well was holding 18 feet of water above its bottom, compared to the 4 feet it had held at its lowest point in August. This response pattern, the speed and proportion of it, told Alvin something important. A static pocket would have responded more slowly and less proportionately to surface precipitation. A connected system would respond quickly and in proportion to the catchment area feeding it. The well was responding like a connected system. It had a catchment. It was alive. He drove out to Dale Halverson's southwest corner on the afternoon of the 4th day. Dale had been working the test shaft for 3 weeks, with his son Craig helping on weekends, and had reached a depth of 28 feet in gravel that Dale described as getting progressively wetter. Did the rain affect it? Alvin asked. Dale pointed at the water in the bottom of the shaft, visible in the headlamp light. Came up 8 inches in 2 days, he said. Whatever's down there is connected to the surface system somehow. Not directly, the water quality's good, it's been filtered. But connected. You're in it, Alvin said. Same buried channel? Same buried channel. Different access point. Dale stood beside the shaft for a long moment, looking at the water he had found because he had noticed where his cattle went to stand on a hot day. My father told me something once, Dale said. He said that everything on this land has a reason. Even things that look random. The way the land lies, the way the grass grows, the way the animals move. It all has a reason if you look long enough. Your father was right, Alvin said. I'd forgotten, Dale said. The Ogallala was so easy. You drilled a hole and there it was, 280 feet down, more water than you'd ever need. You stopped looking. Most people did, Alvin said. Kyle Masterson drove out to the creek farm on a Tuesday morning in late October, alone, without calling ahead. He had been back in Denver since early September, writing his drought assessment report for the Division of Water Resources. The creek farm had been a persistent complication in his analysis. The data did not support what Alvin Creek had found. The hydrogeological models for the Weld County section showed no significant intermediate aquifer between the perched water table and the Ogallala. The test bore from 1965, half a mile to the east, had shown only clay and dense silt at the 40 to 60 foot depth range. The models were based on good data, accepted methodology, and the professional consensus of people who had spent careers studying the hydrogeology of this part of Colorado. The models were, apparently, wrong. At least locally. Kyle Masterson was 28 years old and had been working for the division for 14 months. He was smart enough to know that being wrong early in a career, and acknowledging it clearly, was better for the career than defending a wrong position into the long record. He was also genuinely curious, not just professionally but in the way of a person who has encountered something that doesn't fit his model of the world and cannot stop thinking about why. Alvin was at the barn when Kyle arrived, doing the morning feeding. Kyle waited in the yard until Alvin came out, and Alvin saw him and recognized him and said, "Coffee," the way farmers say it, not a question, not an offer exactly, just a directional statement about what was going to happen next. They sat at the kitchen table. "I've been writing my drought assessment," Kyle said. "I wanted to come out and see your well before I finalized the section on alternative water sources." "You were pretty confident it wasn't going to work," Alvin said. "Not unkindly. I was working from the standard model for this area," Kyle said. "The standard model didn't account for the feature you found." "What does the standard model say about it now?" "I've been talking to a colleague at the Colorado Geological Survey. She thinks what you may have accessed is a relict paleo channel, an old stream channel that was buried by alluvial deposition, probably during the late Pleistocene. The paleo channel has different porosity characteristics than the surrounding matrix, which would explain both the higher permeability and the differential surface expression, the green grass, the topographic depression." He paused. "She's interested in coming out to sample if you'd allow it." She's welcome, Alvin said. The implications: if there's a network of paleochannels in this area and if they're accessible at depths between 40 and 60 feet, it could be significant for drought resilience planning. Not as a replacement for the Ogallala, but as a supplemental source that doesn't require the deep drilling infrastructure and can recharge on a faster cycle. Like a savings account versus a retirement fund, Alvin said. Kyle looked at him. That's actually a good analogy. My grandfather used the same idea about water, Alvin said. He talked about the Ogallala the way people talked about inheritances. Something that had been accumulating for a long time and would support you if you used it carefully. And about shallower water the way people talk about wages. Less impressive, but it refills every year. Kyle was quiet for a moment, writing in his notebook. The well log from the 1965 test bore, I've been looking at it again. There's a layer at 53 feet described as coarse angular gravel, slightly calcareous, with possible iron staining. The log notes it as anomalous and the driller apparently moved on without investigating it further. That might be the same feature. It probably is, Alvin said. The driller was looking for the Ogallala, Kyle said. 50 feet wasn't deep enough to be interesting. He was looking for what he was looking for, Alvin said. He wasn't looking for what was actually there. Kyle set down his pen. After a moment he said, I want to write about your well and my assessment. With your permission. I want to be honest about what the standard model suggested and what the field evidence showed. I think it's important for the record. Write what you think is true, Alvin said. That's all anyone should do. Kyle drove back toward Denver in the afternoon, and what he thought about on the drive, not data or analysis but something closer to a reckoning, was the gap between the models he had been trained to use and the thing Alvin Creek had done. He had spent 2 years in graduate school studying Colorado hydrology. He knew the Ogallala's depth contours and recharge rates and the political history of the Colorado Water Compact. He knew the isotopic signatures of different water sources and the mathematics of aquifer drawdown and recovery. He had never watched a patch of grass stay green when everything around it went brown, and thought about what that meant, for 38 years. He wrote for a long time that evening in his apartment in Denver, and what he wrote was not a report but an honest accounting of what he had assumed, what the evidence had shown, and what the gap between those two things suggested about the limitations of models built in offices rather than read in the field. Frank Donnelly's South Pasture dig reached 32 feet in late October, and at 32 feet the crew, Frank had hired 2 young men from a fencing operation in Kersey who were strong and not afraid of confined spaces, hit the same feature Alvin had described, coarse angular gravel, wet and cold, with the faint sound of water moving somewhere below. Alvin was there when they found it. Frank had called him at 7 in the morning, his voice stripped of its customary authority by something that might have been wonder. I think we're in something. Can you come? Alvin drove over and went down into the shaft on the rope and crouched at the bottom with his headlamp on and his hands in the gravel and confirmed what Frank's crew had found. Same thing? Frank asked, from above. Same thing, Alvin called up. Might be a bit shallower here. Different angle of the channel, or the channel is higher in this section. Is it connected? To your well? I think so. Same paleochannel system. Different access point. He came up out of the shaft and stood in the October sunlight, cool now, the bite of autumn in it, the sky a deep Colorado blue that was different from the white hammer sky of August, and looked at Frank Donnelly's South Pasture. Frank was standing at the edge of the shaft, looking down into it. He was a big man, Frank Donnelly, thick through the chest and shoulders, and the expression on his face was one that Alvin had not seen on him before. Not pride. Something quieter than pride. Something adjacent to humility, which on Frank Donnelly's face looked like an expression being tried on for the first time and not entirely comfortable yet. I owe you something, Frank said. More than an apology. I made it harder for you to do this. You made it noisier, Alvin said. Harder is when someone stops you. You didn't stop me. I tried to talk people out of taking you seriously. You did, Alvin agreed. But the people who mattered knew me well enough to take me seriously anyway. And the people who didn't know me, well, they'll know me differently now. Frank was quiet for a moment. What do you need from me? He asked. Not as an apology, just, what can I do that would be useful? Alvin thought about it. There's a local history organization in Greeley, he said. They're trying to raise money to preserve the old Platte Valley hydrological records, the survey maps from the 1890s and early 1900s, the well logs, the drainage records. Those records might help identify other paleochannel locations. They're looking for $3,000 to get them digitized and archived. Frank Donnelly looked at him. $3, oh. That's what they need. That seems modest, Frank said. He had been thinking about something large and dramatic, something proportionate to the wrong he had done. Old records are modest things, Alvin said. Until you need them. Frank Donnelly wrote the check the next morning. The hydrological records were digitized that winter and entered into the Colorado State Library's archive, where they would eventually be consulted, 14 years later, by a researcher at Colorado State University who was mapping subsurface drainage features in the South Platte Basin and who found, in the old survey maps, evidence of a paleochannel network running for 60 miles through Weld and Logan counties that had never been systematically investigated. But that was later. In October 1989, Frank Donnelly just wrote the check and didn't make a speech about it. Dr. Patricia Enfield from the Colorado Geological Survey came to the Creek Farm in early November, driving a state vehicle loaded with equipment, ground-penetrating radar, soil core sampling rigs, a portable water chemistry lab. She was 45 years old, with a manner that was efficient and genuinely interested in equal measure. She spent 2 days at the Creek Farm and 1 day each at the Halverson and Donnelly properties. She ran the ground-penetrating radar in transects across the green patch in Alvin's southeast corner, and what the radar showed was, in her words, striking, a buried feature approximately 30 feet wide and running northwest to southeast, at a depth of 40 to 55 feet, with reflectivity characteristics consistent with a gravel-filled paleochannel. She sampled the water from all 3 wells and analyzed it on site. The water chemistry was consistent across all 3 samples, the same isotopic signature, the same mineral content, the same age indicators. All 3 wells were drawing from the same source. She came to the Creek farmhouse on the evening of the second day and sat at the kitchen table with Alvin and Kyle Masterson, who had driven up from Denver to be present for the preliminary findings. The feature runs from your southeast corner to the Halverson southwest pasture to somewhere on the Donnelly South property and almost certainly beyond, she said. Based on the topography and the old drainage records Kyle found in the state archive, I think this is a paleochannel of the Dry Creek system, the creek that runs along your north fence line. The current surface creek is a much smaller, recent feature. The original Dry Creek was substantially larger, probably a post-glacial meltwater channel, and it ran on a different alignment that is now buried under 4 to 6 meters of alluvial deposits. How much water does it carry? Kyle asked. It's not a river, Dr. Enfield said carefully. It's a saturated sedimentary deposit with some throughflow. Think of it as a very slow-moving underground stream. At the locations where Mr. Creek and Mr. Halverson have sunk their wells, the yield seems to be in the range of 2 to 4 gallons per minute, perhaps 200 to 400 gallons per day with appropriate management. The Donnelly location may be similar. Not enough to irrigate, Alvin said. No. Not enough to replace Ogallala irrigation. But enough for livestock water. Enough to supplement. Enough to provide a reliable source during drought conditions when the shallower perched water table fails and before the Ogallala access becomes critical. Dr. Enfield paused. And the system recharges on a much faster cycle than the Ogallala. The precipitation response you described, the water level rising within 48 hours of rain, suggests a recharge cycle of weeks to months, not decades to millennia. This is a fundamentally different kind of water resource than the deep aquifer. It's the wages versus the inheritance, Alvin said. Dr. Enfield looked at him. I'm sorry? Something my grandfather said. About the difference between slow water and fast water. He talked about the deep water as something that had been accumulating for a very long time and had to be spent carefully. And about shallower water as something that refilled regularly, not as much, not as reliable in any single year, but sustainable over time. That's a sophisticated understanding of hydrological resource dynamics, Dr. Enfield said, and she was not being condescending. She meant it precisely. He was a sophisticated farmer, Alvin said. He just didn't use those words for it. The final accounting of the 1989 drought in Weld County was made over the following months. 12 farms in the county had experienced complete Ogallala well failure during the drought, requiring them to purchase water from tanker services or in 2 cases to partially destock their cattle herds. 3 farms had experienced crop losses significant enough to trigger federal drought assistance applications. The total economic impact on the county's agricultural sector ran into several $1 million. Alvin Creek had not experienced complete well failure. His Ogallala pump had continued to run at reduced capacity throughout the drought, supplemented by the hand-dug well, which had provided consistent stock water throughout August and September. His winter wheat had been planted on schedule. His cattle herd had been fully maintained. He had spent approximately $340 on the well restoration, the rope and winch and harness and pump and storage tank and miscellaneous hardware. He had spent approximately 120 hours of his own labor over 3 weeks. He had not needed a drilling rig. He had not needed an electrician. He had not called the tanker service. At the November County Farm Bureau meeting, Gerald Marsh acknowledged what had happened. He said clearly that the Paleochannel wells had demonstrated a water resilience strategy that deserved to be taken seriously in the county's drought planning. He was working with Kyle Masterson and Dr. Enfield to develop a county-level assessment of potential Paleochannel locations that could be made available to interested farmers. Not a replacement for Ogallala water management, he emphasized. A supplement. An additional option. A thing that was there if you knew to look for it. After the meeting, in the parking lot, Gerald Marsh found Alvin Creek at his truck and shook his hand and said, simply, "Thank you." Alvin said, "You're welcome," and drove home. That was the whole of the public acknowledgement. It was enough. Dale Halverson's eldest son Craig was 29 years old in 1989, and he had been working on the family farm since he graduated from high school. He had also, in those 11 years, made some decisions that reflected the values of his generation, decisions oriented toward scale and efficiency and the technologies of modern agriculture, toward Ogallala irrigation and precision planting. The drought of 1989 had been educational for Craig Halverson in the way that genuinely difficult experiences are educational, not pleasantly, but permanently. He had watched his father notice where the cattle bunched in the southwest pasture, and tell Alvin Creek about it, and receive in return the knowledge of what to do with that observation. He had helped dig the well on the weekends. He had lowered himself into the shaft and felt the gravel give under his hands and felt the cold water seeping in, and he had understood, in a way that no classroom instruction could have conveyed, what the ground held and how you found it and why it mattered. In the spring of 1990, Craig Halverson walked every pasture on the family farm with a notebook, looking for the surface indicators that Alvin had taught him, the slight depressions, the grass that stayed green longest, the places where the cattle went by preference on hot days. He found 2 additional locations that he thought were worth investigating. He described them to Alvin and Alvin came and walked them with him and confirmed that both were worth a test hole. One produced water at 34 feet. The other at 41. By the summer of 1990, the Halverson operation had 4 supplemental wells in addition to its 3 Ogallala irrigation wells, a level of water redundancy that would prove valuable in the dry summers of 1993 and 2002 and the severe drought of 2012. Craig Halverson, by the time he was fully running the operation in the late 1990s, had developed his own version of the practice, his own way of reading the land, his own accumulated observations about where the water went and how the ground held it. He had passed it to his own children in the way that practical knowledge passes, not as a formal lesson but as a habit of attention that made you the kind of person who notices things other people walk past. He called it watching the grass. His kids called it the same thing. Alvin Creek kept the well. This was perhaps the simplest statement of what the summer of 1989 meant for the Creek farm. Not that he had found water where the models said there was none, not that he had been right and the experts had been wrong, not even that the old skills had proven their value in a crisis. All of these things were true. But the lasting fact was simply that the well was there. He maintained it with the regular care that keeps a stone-lined shaft clear of debris and the mortar tight between the stones and the pump lubricated and the foot valve clean. He checked it every spring and every fall. He measured the water level and noted it in the farm ledger he had maintained since 1958, along with the rainfall data and the Ogallala water table measurements and the crop yields, so that the record of the farm's water situation was continuous across decades and could be read by anyone who wanted to understand what this specific piece of ground had held and done over time. In the dry summer of 1994, the well provided stock water for 6 weeks when the Ogallala pump went intermittent. In 2002, another bad drought year, it provided stock water for the entire summer. In 2012, the worst drought since 1989 by some measures, it provided stock water and supplemental household water when the rural water district's pressure dropped to the point where reliable service was compromised. Each time, it was there. Robert Creek drove up from Denver on a Friday afternoon in October 1989, the weekend after the October rains had ended, and when he turned into the farm lane and saw the familiar shape of the house and the barn and the machine shed against the Colorado sky, he felt the sensation that people feel when they return to a place that was formative, not quite nostalgia, because it was too physical for that word, and not quite homecoming, because he had built his life elsewhere and would return to it on Sunday. Something in between. The sense of a version of himself that still existed here, waiting patiently for him to visit it. He had called his father the week before, after Alvin's account of the well had made its way to Denver through a chain involving Dale Halverson's brother-in-law who worked in the Denver area. Robert had listened to his father describe what he had found, what he had done about it, what the Geological Survey team had confirmed, and had felt a complex emotion he had not entirely sorted out before making the decision to come. Part of it was admiration. His father was 68 years old and had dug a well by hand through a drought summer on the basis of 38 years of watching grass. This was either the stubbornness of an old man or the culmination of a lifetime of paying attention to the right things, and Robert had spent enough time in the business world to recognize that the line between those two things was often invisible until after the fact. Alvin was at the kitchen table when Robert came in, with a cup of coffee and the farm ledger open to the current season's pages. He looked up and said, "There's coffee," and Robert poured himself a cup and sat across from his father and looked at the ledger. The ledger was a large, hardbound book with lined pages, and it contained entries in his father's careful handwriting going back to 1958. Each season had its own section: dates of planting and harvest, yields by field, rainfall and irrigation records, equipment repairs, livestock numbers, prices received. Robert had seen this ledger many times and had always been impressed by its comprehensiveness. But looking at it now, he noticed something he had not noticed before. The water records were the most detailed section. Each entry noted not just the Ogallala pump output and the rainfall but the level in the hand-dug well, measured every spring and every fall since 1958. 31 years of well data, recorded in the same book as the crop data, as if the two things were of equal significance to the operation. "You've been measuring it every year," Robert said. "Every year," Alvin confirmed. "Why? You weren't using it." "I was watching it." Alvin turned the ledger to show Robert the well data column. "Look at 76. Dry summer. Well dropped 6 feet from May to August but didn't fail. Look at 80. Wet summer. Well was the highest I'd ever recorded. Look at 88, the year before this drought. Already down 4 feet from the previous year's high water mark." Robert looked at the column of numbers. The numbers told a story he had not known was being told: the slow, annual fluctuation of a water source connected to the seasons and the rainfall in the larger hydraulic system of the region, expressed in feet of water depth in a 36-inch shaft 40-something feet in the ground. "You knew the drought was coming," Robert said. "I knew the water was lower than usual going into this summer," Alvin said. "I didn't know we'd get a summer this bad. But I knew the baseline was lower. So when it got bad, I knew sooner than I might have otherwise that I needed to act." Robert was quiet for a moment. "I should have known this," he said. "About the well. About what you were watching and what it meant." "You weren't here to learn it," Alvin said. Without reproach. A statement of fact. "And I didn't press. It was your life to make." "Dad." "Robert." Alvin put his hand on the ledger. "I'm not asking you to come back and farm. I know that's not what you want. But I'd like you to learn the well. Where it is, what it produces, how to read it. The ledger will be yours when I'm done with it. The record means something. But only if someone knows how to read it." They walked to the southeast corner of the pasture in the October afternoon, and Alvin showed Robert everything: the green patch, now dimmer in the October light but still distinguishable from the surrounding brown, the well cap, the pump, the storage tank, the rope and harness hanging from the winch post beside the shaft. He showed Robert how to measure the water level and how to read the pump output and how to recognize the signs that the foot valve needed replacement. He showed Robert the stone lining of the shaft and told him about Erastus cutting and hauling that stone in the summer of 1903, working alone, in heat that Robert's generation had no accurate reference for because they had grown up with air conditioning. He told Robert about the morning he had found the moving water at 45 feet, and what it had felt like to crouch in the dark shaft and hear that sound. Robert listened with the attention of a person who knows they need to carry something. He took notes in his pocket notebook. He asked practical questions, the questions of a man who manages things for a living and understands that management requires specific knowledge rather than general impressions. At the end, standing beside the well in the October light, Robert said, "I'll come back in the spring. I'll spend a week. You can show me the maintenance." Alvin nodded. "Good. I can't promise anything about the long term," Robert said. "My life is in Denver. I don't know what happens to this farm after." He stopped. "I know," Alvin said. "Whatever happens, I want the well to be in the record. I want whoever comes next to know it's there and what it means. Even if it's not family." Robert looked at the well cap. "You'd sell?" "To the right person. Someone who'd take the ledger seriously." Alvin paused. "I've been thinking about a land trust. Something that would require agricultural use in perpetuity. There are organizations that do that." "That's actually a good idea, Dad." "I'm not senile yet," Alvin said, pleasantly. They walked back to the farmhouse in the October afternoon, and Robert stayed through the weekend and helped with the fall work, And on Sunday evening when he drove back down to Denver, he carried with him the knowledge of the well and what it meant and how to read it, not the 38 years of watching, which could not be transferred in a weekend, but the practice of it. The beginning of it. The understanding that there was something here worth attending to. It was enough to start with. Nora Creek had grown up with the well the way children grow up with the defining features of their home landscape, not as a curiosity or a lesson but as a fact, as ordinary and specific as the shape of the barn roof or the sound the screen door made in the wind. Her grandfather Alvin had taken her to it when she was 4 years old, and she had stood on the edge of the shaft and looked down into the dark and smelled the cold mineral air coming up from below and had understood, without words, that this was a serious place. He had taken her again when she was 8, and again at 12, and the third time he had let her go down on the rope, a brief descent, only 15 feet, just enough for her to experience the change in temperature and the darkness and the sound that was different from the surface world in a way she could not entirely describe even as an adult. It was the sound of deep patience. The sound of something that had been there a very long time and would continue to be there regardless of what happened above it. By the time Nora was farming the creek land in 2022, she had been down the well more times than she could count. She had replaced the foot valve twice, relaid 3 courses of stone in the lining where a section had loosened over a winter, and installed a solar-powered pump system in 2019 after a careful evaluation of the options. She had maintained the ledger her grandfather Alvin had started in 1958, adding her own entries in a different handwriting but the same columns, so that the record of the well's water level was now continuous across 64 years. She had also added a new column. She had started recording, in the spring each year, the extent of the green patch around the well, measured in approximate diameter, noted as a simple number in feet. In the wet year of 2019, the green patch had extended to nearly 60 feet in diameter. In the dry spring of 2021, it had contracted to 30 feet. These numbers told a story about the underground system that the well level alone could not fully convey, a story about how the water moved through the buried channel in response to the season, widening in wet years and narrowing in dry ones, always present but always adjusting. In the severe drought of 2022, when the Ogallala water table in Weld County dropped to levels not seen since the 1950s and irrigation wells across the region were again going intermittent or failing, Nora Creek's hand-dug well, Erastus's well, Alvin's well, Robert's well, was producing 280 gallons a day. She had found 2 additional locations in her pastures showing the same surface indicators, had dug test holes at both with a rented mini excavator, and found saturated gravel at 38 and 41 feet respectively. She had installed pitcher pumps at both locations before the drought season began. All 3 wells produced water through the entire summer. Her neighbor to the east, a young man named Tyler Weston who had bought the adjacent property 2 years earlier and was operating it on a business model centered on high-volume irrigation and maximum yield per acre, had 3 Ogallala wells, all of which had gone intermittent by July. He called the drilling company and was told the wait was 3 months. He called the tanker service and was quoted a price that made the economics of his summer look very bad. He had also, in July, noticed that the grass in the southwest corner of his land was staying green when everything else had gone brown. He called Nora Creek. She drove over and walked the corner with him, the same walk her grandfather had walked with Frank Donnelly and Dale Halverson 33 years earlier, looking at the grass and the topography and the way the soil felt at 8 inches down. She found the depression, barely a foot of relief over 80 feet of diameter, so subtle that you would only notice it if you were looking for it. She dug a test hole with a post-hole digger and found the soil noticeably cooler at 14 inches. "There's something here," she told Tyler Weston. "What is it?" "Paleochannel. Old buried drainage feature. My grandfather found it on our place in 1989 and the Geological Survey confirmed it. The feature runs through this area, it's probably accessible on your property too." Tyler Weston was 26 years old and had a degree in agricultural business and subscriptions to 3 precision farming data services and had never in his life dug anything by hand that was deeper than a fence post hole. He looked at the slight depression in the brown pasture grass and tried to see what Nora Creek was seeing. "How deep?" he asked. "Probably 35 to 45 feet. You'd need to dig a test hole to find out exactly." "Can I use a machine?" "You can. But the shaft needs to be about 36 inches in diameter to be workable, and you need to be careful about soil conditions as you go down. It's not just digging." She helped him rent the excavator and showed him what to look for as the bucket went down, and at 41 feet the excavator bucket came up with gravel noticeably darker with moisture than the material above it, and she told him to stop and use the hand tools from here. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has just been told the next step requires something he has not done before. "I'll show you," she said. They worked together for 2 days, Tyler Weston learning as they went, and found the water at 43 feet, the same depth Alvin had found it, in the same paleo channel, at a location 400 yards to the east. When they came up out of the shaft on the evening of the second day, Tyler Weston sat on the ground beside the open hole and looked at the gravel on his hands and the water on his boots and said, "I didn't know this was here." "Most people don't," Nora said. "How did your grandfather know?" "He watched the grass." She looked at the green patch beginning to establish itself around the disturbed ground where they had worked, the water seeping up through the capillary channels in the soil, feeding the grass roots, giving the grass what it needed to stay green when everything around it went brown. "Water doesn't forget where it wants to go," she said. "The grass knows." Tyler Weston looked at the grass for a long time. He was a young man educated in precision farming and data analysis and the business of modern agriculture, and he was sitting in the dirt beside a hand-dug hole in a drought-year pasture, and he was beginning to understand something that was not in any of his training. "How long does it take," he asked, "to learn to read the grass?" Nora Creek thought about her grandfather, who had started learning in 1951, when his father crouched beside the green patch in the southeast corner of the pasture and showed him what to notice. Who had watched that patch for 38 years before he needed it to tell him something in a crisis. Who had found the water in the summer of 1989 not because he went looking for it that summer but because he had never stopped looking for it in any summer. "A long time," she said. "You start now." Alvin Creek died in the winter of 2011, at 90 years of age, in the farmhouse on the north end of the property where he had moved 6 years earlier. He died in his sleep, in December, and the obituary in the Greeley Tribune said he had farmed in Weld County for 53 years. This was technically correct but missed the point in the way that obituaries often miss the point, reducing a life's significance to its duration rather than its texture. What it did not say was that he had dug a well by hand in a drought year and found water where the official models said there wasn't any, and that this had mattered to 3 neighboring farms and eventually to the county's drought resilience planning. What it did not say was that he had learned to read water in the grass, through 38 years of paying attention to a patch of green in the southeast corner of his pasture, from a principle his father had given him that his father had received from Erastus, who had received it, in some form, from the land itself. Robert Creek took over the farm in 2005 and ran it for 17 years before passing it to his daughter Nora. Nora Creek was a different kind of farmer than Alvin or Robert had been, younger, more connected to the agricultural technology world, interested in precision farming and soil health and the emerging science of regenerative agriculture. She used GPS guidance on her tractor and subscribed to a satellite soil moisture service and had taken a course in drone-based crop monitoring at Colorado State. She also maintained the well. She maintained it not out of obligation but out of the same instinct that had kept Alvin's parts shelf-stocked and his ledger current and his operating costs below what anyone would have thought strictly necessary, the instinct that said, "The world is going to be difficult sometimes, and the time to prepare for difficulty is before it arrives." She lowered a weighted string into the shaft on the evening after she and Tyler found his water, and measured the level. It was rising, slowly, steadily, with the patient persistence of water finding its level in a connected system. In the southeast corner of the creek farm, a quarter-mile to the west, the green patch around Erastus's well was bright in the evening light, emerald against the surrounding brown, alive and specific and grounded in something the drought could not reach. The water was there. It had always been there. It would be there in the next drought and the one after that. Not abundant. Not a solution to everything. Just enough, reliably, for the people who had learned to look and had kept looking and had maintained the shaft and the pump and the stone lining with the regular, faithful care that keeps old things working through new difficulties. The grass had known all along. You just had to learn to ask it. The drought conditions described in this novel, while fictionalized and set in 1989, reflect real climatic patterns that have affected the Colorado Plains repeatedly over the past century. The Ogallala Aquifer depletion described in this story is an ongoing and serious concern affecting the agricultural economies of 8 states. Paleochannels, buried ancient river channels with different hydrological characteristics than surrounding sediment, are a real geological feature documented in various parts of the Great Plains. They have been identified as potential supplemental water sources in some drought resilience research, though systematic investigation of their extent and utility remains incomplete. The practice of reading surface vegetation and topographic indicators to locate subsurface water was common among farmers and homesteaders of the late 19th and early 20th century. Much of this practical knowledge has been lost as mechanical drilling made it unnecessary. The pitcher pump Alvin installs is a real piece of equipment, still manufactured today, and still appropriate for shallow wells where electricity is unavailable or undesirable. All characters are fictional. Weld County, Colorado is real. The Ogallala Aquifer is real. The drought years of 1989, 2002, and 2012 were real. The grass knows.